Hello, everyone. Welcome into Above My Pay Grade. My name is Eric. I have a special guest today, uneducated economist. He was gracious enough to lend me some of his time so I can pick his brain. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great, man. Thank you for having me on your show today.
Yeah. And if you guys aren't familiar with him, he's got a great channel. I'll link it in the description below. But I've learned a lot from him. He has I would say, he has a great way of explaining very complex topics to dummies like myself.
Yeah. Yeah, I started my channel in November of 2017 and really I never thought it was going to go anywhere. I would just kind of babble on about economics to my coworkers and friends and stuff, and I remember this coworker of mine, her name was Brittany, and she was a big tall girl. No, she's not big, she was just tall, and she comes up and she puts her hands on my desk and she says, dude, listen, you're going to have to start a blog or a YouTube channel or something because nobody here understands anything you're talking about and you are driving us crazy. And so I was like, oh, okay, right. All right. So I went down that day, fired up my camera, did an introductory video to the uneducated economist and started posting videos. Really, nobody paid attention to anything for quite a few months. I get a couple of views here and there, and a couple of likes and comments, and a few people would subscribe. But it was when I started talking about the lumber industry and the housing industry that people really started to listen. And I had been putting out videos talking about the lumber industry long before lumber ran up to its 1700 per thousand, and so
Mhm.
I got a lot of attention for that. And that's when I met George Gammon and all the other crew from the Rebel Capitalist, and really changed a lot of my life. So yeah, here I am.
That's awesome, dude.
Yeah, thank you.
What was the catalyst? Like, what was your interest in economics? Where did that come from?
Uh, Failure. Yeah, failure. It was 2007. I tried buying a house, and immediately, you know, things went bad. With the housing market, and tried to hold on for a long time, and just eventually just couldn't do it anymore, and got into foreclosure. So when all that was taking place, I'm trying to figure out what was going on. I'm like, why is there this housing market crash? What's this going on? I'd fire up the news and, I hear these guys, mortgage backed securities, credit default swaps. And I'm just like, what is this? And so I turn off the news, went over to my computer. What's a mortgage backed security?
Mhm.
And just like started reading, it was just like, okay, so it's like a jumble of loans, put into security. What's a credit default swap? Insurance policy, all this. And I'm like, oh, okay, now I'm starting to get it. This thing was like a big mortgage backed securities. These things went bad. Insurance policies kicked in. And I'm like, okay, now I'm starting to get this. And, we got the movie, The Big Short, that really explains that whole situation pretty well. And, I'm like, okay. So I started picking up little pieces, just doing internet research. And a buddy of mine gave me the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island.
Mm.
And after I read that, I was like, okay, so that exposed me to the Federal Reserve. I mean, it was just full on, just as much as I could take in from everybody who was willing to speak about it. To I would read just as much as I could as far as like Federal Reserve speeches and stuff. I have a reading disability, so I can only go for about 10 minutes before my mind really starts to wander. So short articles or speeches, that's all I could take in at a time. And so I would just do just constant input. I was like that Johnny Five from Short Circuit, more input, more input. And yeah, I just kind of slowly started piecing all this stuff together until I could start, talking about it. And yeah, here I am, man. Again, it's just like it was the failure I think that really sparked it because I was like, what's going on? Why is my life changing? How come I lost my job? How come I'm losing my
Mm.
house? What's going on here? And yeah, that's really what did it for me.
Yeah, being interested in economics, I have found because my catalyst was I've always been interested in personal finance. Macro, I kind of got interested in when I saw the stock market going up and to the right in 2020 and no one was working. And I was like, how does this work? So I started looking into the Federal Reserve. I kind of knew what it was, but, um, and it's kind of a blessing and a curse being interested in macroeconomics because you can get, seeing what's going on in the world, you can get really frustrated at the amount of political, because I always say, where you spend money is a political question. How much money you spend is a math question. But people turn that into a political question, which is how much money you spend. And so I look at the world, specifically the United States, and I get super frustrated, reading history, reading things about Weimar, and I'm like, this is not a joking matter. This is not something that you just kind of, it's just two different opinions. It's math, and if you deny it, you're going to suffer the consequences as a society.
Oh yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think what you just said there is like this isn't a game. Like,
Yeah,
a lot of people think it's just like, it's like some kind of entertainment thing, that we come out here and, put these videos out or something like that. I kind of call myself an entertainer a lot because that's kind of what I do on the side thing. And I try to make sure that my videos are entertaining, but the information that's within it is the real thing. I mean, this is how we are conducting ourselves in our lives, and yeah, this isn't a joking matter. A lot of people they want to push blame on political sides and stuff like that, and when you're casting blame, you're not making good decisions for yourself because your expectations are on the outside there. And that's really what I think this comes down to, is that if you can really figure out these economic systems, the cause and effects of things, then you can really start making decisions for yourself that are going to benefit you. And it's not necessarily like the decisions that you make for yourself may not be what somebody else does. And so when you're hearing somebody else's opinion on what they're doing, that might be a totally inappropriate decision for what you would do.
hmm
um, I related a lot down to being out on the Columbia River. I live alongside the Columbia River, the river. And
hmm
there's a lot of boats that go up and down that river, and you can be on a little tiny 12-foot duck skiff, or you can be in one of those giant freighters that's hauling grain out here. And those guys who are operating those boats, they are not thinking the same thing when they're out there on the river. The guy who's
right,
operating that duck skiff is not paying attention to the same thing that the guy in the freighter's taking and paying attention to. And so they're both on the river, they're both in the boat, they're both dealing with the weather, but they are not thinking the same thing. And
right.
this is really what economics is like.
hmm Yeah, I think the other thing I think about is that there's this human element to behavior that is somewhat of an unknown quantity. Like economics is math, but then you got that human behavior side. I've been reading or read When Money Dies about Weimar, and what people were thinking at the time was so fascinating. Um, and so that's where politics and economics comes into play. And I think the more you can understand macroeconomics, it's not just like making wise financial decisions, it's hedging against human behavior, because human incentives is to want stuff for free to a certain extent, at least for you, maybe not for everybody else, but people have their pet political thing that they want to spend money on, whether it be military or what have you. And that I think is going to lead. Like I was listening to the State of the Union, for instance, last night, and I was like, the thing I took away from it was we're not going to stop spending. There's no political will to look at the reality, because they give you these binary choices: cut Social Security or don't cut Social Security. It's like, well, that's not actually the choice. It's cut or it goes away over time, right? And I don't know. I just don't know. I think sometimes people need pain to come to that reality. It needs to be painful enough for them to realize no matter what they ask the government to do, they can't help them.
Um, yeah, well, I mean, I was big into following politics and all that a long time ago. I mean, there was a time when I was very, very much in tune. I knew every congressperson's
Yeah.
name and was very much on top of the bills and all that. I got very disheartened, um, from politics when I saw Ron Paul getting blackballed out of the Republican Party, like basically given no chance to speak or debate or anything, and I'm like, this isn't right. I mean, these
Mhm.
guys are not on my side. They don't think the way I do. This isn't for me anymore.
Right.
So I gave up on everything for a long time. Like I didn't look at anything for years. And when I did get back into stuff, I said, just follow the money. Just follow that money and, pay attention to that and kind of let everything else go. And so that's kind of what I did. What I found now is that I'm pretty sure the way the system is now set up, and I'm sure that the powers that be are aware of it, that there is no reversal to this. There's no fixing like the problem,
Mhm,
like it's like whatever it is that the problem is, people have, inequality, they don't make enough money, they don't, whatever, they don't have healthcare, whatever it is, whatever that problem is, it isn't going to get fixed, right? It isn't going to get any better, and there's no reversal to this. There's nobody that you're going to vote for that's going to come in and save the day, and there's nobody coming to help you. Like,
mhm,
that's it. There's nobody
yep,
there. So you really are on your own. No matter how much you want to believe that, there's, the right politician or something, they're not coming. She's not coming, right? There's
mhm,
nobody. And so that's really where we have to understand like what is happening here, because to me, like we were talking just, briefly about the Cantillon effect. To me, that is a very wise theory to take in, not just because like it's a good economic theory in my opinion, but because of how old it is. It's from the 1700s. And if you can find correlations from the 1700s that are now playing out today, these are economic powers that don't change. Like these are
mhm,
forces that are going to continue. And as far as I can see, this country was a manufacturing powerhouse at one time. Like back in the 50s, 60s, we were killing it, right? We were doing quite well. We would manufacture the best stuff in the world and sell it to the world. And when we started getting that money in, we were really enjoying that standard of living. And as that new money poured in, we started driving out the domestic manufacturing here as we were enjoying those higher standards of living and enjoying the new money that was coming in. And we ended up buying a lot of foreign imports because of that. And when we ended up driving in so much foreign imports and driving out so much domestic manufacturing, we eventually got to a point where the new money was no longer coming in. This is Nixon's problem. So all this gold that was typically what was used for a gold standard, even though it was like not really a gold standard, but it was, right? Well, eventually got to a point where it was just like, okay, well, there's nobody who's going to be doing business with you anymore. And there's this concentration of wealth happening with it all. We're going to have to sever this gold standard and fire up them printing presses. And now the new money comes in through pure fiat currency, right? It's not a gold standard. It's not the selling of merchandise. It's the selling of debt, right? That debt is what brings in the new money into this country. And now, as we have this new money coming in from the issuance of debt, now we can buy just about as much stuff from the world as we could possibly imagine because we're doing it with no effort, right? I mean, we're borrowing the money from them and then buying their stuff. I mean, it's just like, I mean, how easy and awesome is that for us? And then now we have to think, oh crap, oh, we're going to continue on with this new money, right? Because it was the world that was sending us their effort. Now we're getting to a point where it's going to be like, okay, we're going to have to just print this money up, right? In order to get the new money injections coming into the system. Because without new money coming in, everybody starts falling into poverty. And so this is now the dilemma that we're in. Like, as far as fixing it, like healthcare or social security or all that other stuff, that is a much smaller problem
oh, yeah,
than what we have coming due to the fact that this Cantillon effect is telling us that if we do not have this new money coming in, we are all going into poverty.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I don't know how to fix that. I
uh,
don't know how to fix that. I get into gold and silver. That's my protection away from that system. So, like if
d
you
so
have something tangible in your hand, you can protect yourself somewhat from that.
so, I I'm a student of history, and the what you just explained, to some degree, has happened before in developed countries. It's happened in Argentina, like, 4 times in the last, I don't know, 40 years or so. But they always have an option of the dollar. They can always there's always a currency that's ubiquitous, and it's usually the dollar that they can kinda have this parallel economy if their currency is hyperinflating. So the one thing that is different, I think, in history today that is unique about the situation is the fact that all Western nations are in a similar boat to us, or if not worse. So how do you see, like, normally this is solved with war, unfortunately. But, how do you see? Because if it was just the United States, I could kinda guess how it might turn out. But the fact that it's most Western nations, most developed nations have this massive debt problem, how do you see it playing out? Like, what if you had a crystal ball and you were making predictions, like, in 5, 10 years, how do you see the United States economy looking comparatively to other developed countries like Europe?
Um, what I see is that we're going to have an economic system that is completely changed that allows the central banks to push us into a negative interest rate. It's really the only way that they can go. Um, you have to think like the Federal Reserve actually did something quite magical for themselves when they were able to create, I shouldn't say they created, but uh, use this creative situation in order to acquire their ammo again, right? And their ammunition is that Fed funds rate, and they want it up at that 5%. That's their ammunition. If they can drop the Fed funds 5%, they can stimulate the economy by getting people to go out there and borrow money to buy houses, cars, go on vacation, stuff like that. So it looks to me like the Federal Reserve has come darn close to acquiring their ammo in order to fight another recession. Maybe, whatever. I
Right.
mean, that's like, they're like possibly, I guess, right? So if that's the case, then I think they actually kind of have some room right now that they could kind of, at least deal with the typical recessions that they would have had in the past by dropping the Fed funds rate. Okay. If that doesn't work, what's going to end up happening is that if they can't drop the Fed funds rate, then they're not going to be able to stimulate the economy. And this is where like it gets really complicated for people to try and understand because when you have low interest rates, that is actually a deflationary act. When you have very low interest rates or interest rates that are close to zero. And I guess the easiest way to kind of understand that is that when you have higher interest rates, given time, right? It doesn't happen right away because it's counterintuitive to the thought, but given time, that higher interest rates will actually stimulate the economy because you'll end up having a return on capital investment, but that takes time to take place. So, what I mean by return on capital investment, say you were inheriting $1 million back in the early 80s. Okay, your uncle, left you $1 million. Boom, you have this cash. You go and you buy U.S. Treasuries with it. You were getting like a 15% return on 10-year yield or 10-year bonds, right? So here you have like this 10-15% return on your 10-year bonds that you have loaned $1 million to the government. You're getting like $150,000 a year. That is a lot of money to spend into the economy, right? So we fast forward to today, you inherit $1 million, you go and loan it to the government at 3.5% interest on your 10-year. You're getting like $35,000 a year. Yeah, it's a lot of money, but for $1 million, that is not like
Mhm.
a lot of money today, right? In the early 80s, $150,000 was a lot of money. So you were able to spend a lot more money off of your capital investment back in the early 80s with higher interest rates than you are when you come into the future and you have low interest rates and your return on capital investment barely beats inflation, right? So you get this return on capital and then you realize by the time you get your capital back and the interest rate paid from it, it barely has, beaten the inflation. If not, it's gone zero. So it's actually a negative return. So this is where low interest rates are slowing the economy down. And unless you have constant stimulus, like pushing out, checks to the people to go out there and actually spend that money into the economy, then the economy just keeps slowing down. And
Mhm.
that's really where the problem was we were facing back in 2018 going into 19. And they knew it. There was a great speech, John Williams' speech. In fact, I have it right here. It's called Monetary Policy Strategies for a Low Neutral Interest Rate World, right? And this is one of my favorite speeches in the entire like whole Federal Reserve like website. They have it was issued. Let's see, they gave this speech on November 30th of 2018, and man, in this speech, he was talking about the low neutral interest rate being a major problem and how they had to figure out how to get that neutral interest rate up higher. Here they are, they got it
Yeah.
right, and so this is pretty cool to have this speech ahead of time explaining a lot of what we're experiencing today. So again, back to that crystal ball, what do I see? Well, if the Federal Reserve has their ammo, okay, that doesn't work. What we're going to end up doing is we're going to have to figure out a way to take interest rates into negative, and that is not going to be something that the Federal Reserve has the ability to do and without like taking cash out of the system. right? Because this is where it starts getting complicated. Because if you go negative interest rates and you have like you go and you take your paycheck down to the bank and you put it in the bank, and they say, "Hey, that's great. You just put $100 in here, but you're only going to get 99 of it back." That
Yeah.
sucks, right? Nobody's going to do that. And nobody's going to be keeping their money in the bank. They're going to be like, "No, thank you. I'll keep it in cash." And so they know that if you go negative, cash is going to be king. You know, everybody's just going to take it and go in the mattress with it. So they got to get the cash out of the system. And that's where this central bank digital currency is such a big push. That's, you know, you're going to hear a lot about it being like a benefit to the people and banking the
Mm,
unbanked or giving, you know, I don't know, they're going to give it like a benefit to the people somehow. But that's not really what it is. This is about taking interest rates negative and going into a cashless society. And, you know, this is not like something I'm making up. I mean, I got this information from the Bureau of International Settlements from their blog. I mean, this is their theories talking about how they were going to use e-currency to replace cash. So it's no surprise to me to see these central bank digital currencies out there. So what they'll have to do is issue out a central bank digital currency, because once you have that and you get it paid in that, it'll keep you forced into their banking system. You won't have the cash to be able to get out. It'll just be either in an account or your account or somebody else's account, but it won't be in cash. And that's really where the critical point is because if they don't have cash in the system, now they can take interest rates into negative and force you to start spending your money. And now this is like really starts like twisting your mind if you can't, like, you know, like it's hard to like hold on to all this
yeah.
stuff, you know. But how they can do this is also going to be in question, because the Federal Reserve, surprisingly to a lot of people, can't print up money and just hand it out to the system, right? They actually have to buy something in order for that money to become, you know, to actually get into the banking system. And what they typically buy is U.S. Treasuries, right? So when they're buying treasuries, they're buying them from the secondary market, which basically means that the big banks, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, those guys, they're the primary dealers. They go to the treasury auction, they get the treasury bonds, right? And then the Federal Reserve buys them from those secondary banks. That's how the money gets there, right? And then that's how the treasury ends up with the money that they can now write checks to everybody else with. Well, the central bank digital currency is going to be a little different from that, because it's going to be a money injection directly from the Federal Reserve right to these digital wallets. And so this is going to have to change the Fed's charter and the way that they are actually illegally allowed to operate. So there's going to have to be some sort of crisis situation, right? This is the thing, a crisis situation in order for Congress to change the Federal Reserve's charter. Right? And the people are going to demand it, because there's no better way to get Congress to act than to have the people pushing them to do it. Right? And what better way do you get people to act? Make them hungry.
Yeah.
So I have a feeling that it's going to be a food shortage that is going to be the trigger for the central bank digital currency to be issued out for everybody to go, here you go, man, go buy your food. Yeah. And then we'll be stuck in that system. That's my crystal ball.
So so a couple follow-ups there. So when you said, uh, lower interest rates are deflationary,
Mhm.
isn't there an initial sugar rush? I'm thinking, okay, lower the interest rates, people can cash out, refi their homes. Obviously, they're getting more cash that they can actually spend in the economy. That's inflationary. But over a longer period of time, it becomes deflationary. Is that what you're saying? Lower
Yeah,
interest rates.
the longer term economic effects of it is a very deflationary effect.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's much yeah, when you get a stimulus like we did, I related a lot to getting high. You know, it's like
Mhm.
it's
Yeah.
just like getting high. You're like, man, I feel great. This is awesome.
Yeah.
This is the best time ever. You know, and then you're all off of it, and you're like, I feel like hell. You know,
Yeah,
and it's just like this is terrible. You know, and I mean, you're
yeah.
all hungover, and you just wish things were normal again, right? Another way to kind of look at it is my beers and saws analogy. I don't know if you ever heard that one, but
Mm-mm.
the beers and saws analogy, when we got the stimulus, right? When you get a stimulus check, if you can imagine that all the money either went into beers or saws, right? And so if you can relate everything in the economy to either being a beer or a saw, right? Like just literally like a skill saw, something that you use to cut up lumber. And now you think about the beer, because this is really where like most of the stimulus went. And if you have beer, you have something that you can really stimulate the economy with. You know, you think about it, there's a lot of agricultural product, you know, manufacturing, distribution, entertainment, consumption. Everything's in beer, right? You know, so as you're stimulating the economy with beer, everybody's drinking the beer, just having a great time, just like, you know, going down. But then once the beer is gone, it's gone. Like there's nothing left from it. And so now you have already consumed all this beer, right? And now you have to work to pay for all this consumption of beer that you've had. So not only do you have to postpone your current consumption to pay for the past consumption, right? But you're also doing it with a hangover, right? Because you've already consumed all this stuff and now you can't consume it anymore. So now you feel bad, right? Because you can't consume as much and you're working hard to pay for it all. Now, let's take the SAWS analogy. If you had taken that stimulus and gone into SAWS with it, well, initially, yeah, it would have taken a while because you really wouldn't have had any kind of real impact from it as you're working these saws and building things with it and selling those products to pay for the saws. But eventually, selling those products would have paid for the saws, and now you can just buy as much beer as you want,
Yeah.
right? But it all went into beer instead of going into sauce. So
Mm.
this is really why we're sitting in a situation in which that the stimulus, although it was very impactful at the time, has left the party is over, right? And there's no more stimulus and there's no more fun, and now it's hard work and paying for the past, and nobody likes doing that.
Yeah. Um, hmm, I like that one.
Yeah, it's a
Um,
good one. I like that
yeah.
Spears and Sauce analogy too. It was a really good one.
So even the way you or the reason you explained they would want a CBDC is to go negative and to keep people trapped in the system so they can't take cash out.
Mhm.
That still doesn't solve the problem that I'm seeing though, like which is the the perceived value of the currency unit, whether it's be a dollar or a CBDC. If the CBDC doesn't revalue debt and it's just one for one, we're still in the same boat, which is we have massive amounts of debt and we're on a fiscal cliff. And slowly but surely, people continually don't trust that currency. Um, how do they solve that conundrum? Because that buys them time, but it doesn't solve the actual root cause.
You can't solve it. No, there will be eventual collapse. I mean,
Mhm.
it's just I mean, I don't see how it can't. I mean, they can get quite creative, right? I mean, if they go into central bank digital currencies, take interest rates negative, they can start doing things like put time limits on money, put
Yeah.
direction on money. Like you can't spend it here, you can spend it there. Like they can go into some really creative stuff to try and keep the economy going. I mean, I I I tried to like come up. Well, they can't go any further than this, and that's it. The cliff is right here at this. I
Mhm.
mean, I already said that a
Yeah.
long time ago. I mean, I done fell and tripped over that thing. Well,
Yeah.
it's just like
Yeah.
I can't make that prediction anymore. So I just kind of come up with this idea that right now they figured out ways that they can deal with the next step. But the step after that, they may not have figured out yet. Right.
Hmm.
Um, I know that the Federal Reserve is smarter than I am, right?
Mhm.
So they have 150 economists down there. They got all the data in the world. If I can think of scenarios, and I'm sure they have already done it too.
Yeah.
And so, like, when I see some of the things that they have set up, like, especially during the pandemic, when they set up them special purpose vehicles, that was like, that came totally as a surprise to me. Like, I mean, I try and find everything that the Federal Reserve is talking about and study and stuff. I had no clue about special purpose vehicles and that those things were about ready to bail out this entire nation, including the corporate debt market. A lot of people don't even realize that that was a complete credible threat. That free, like, this isn't what's really interesting about how the Federal Reserve operates. They set up a special purpose vehicle, funded it with $650 billion, told the media and everybody else in the world that they were going to be buying corporate debt. The place freaked out. Every YouTuber in the world was screaming their heads off about it. The Federal Reserve bought a little bit of corporate debt, and then everybody tried to front run the Federal Reserve by
Yeah.
buying into this corporate debt. The Federal Reserve sat back and said, "Good job, boys. We hardly had to do anything."
Yeah. Yeah.
And you think about it, it was literally the free market that did that, right?
Mhm.
I mean, they took the Federal Reserve and said, "Oh crap, we're gonna like." It's a manipulation tactic, but it
Right.
was still it was the free market making their own decision with their money to go buy this stuff off of the Federal Reserve manipulation thought. They didn't have to do it. They didn't have to believe the Federal Reserve, but they got greedy and decided that they were going to do it, and they bailed out the corporations for them. So now the corporations are sitting on a ton of cash. We're going into the recession. The Federal Reserve doesn't have to bail them out because it's already been done.
Yeah.
It was a very, very good strategy. Like I did not see that coming at all. So,
Yeah.
who knows what tools they have? I mean, it's just, it's,
I just look at like, I know it can go like, I it's hard to put a timeline on it. I just know that when, uh, inflation has to end for your average person to kinda go back to ignorance is bliss. Like, I this is just anecdotal, but it's like people start asking questions about what money is and, like, where the value comes from, if it's slowly eroding away, which it always has been, but if it's eroding away at the level it has been, over the last 2 years, people really see the effects of it. People who aren't even interested in economics, just your average person goes, "This is not okay."
yeah,
If they can't end that, that's that's what like, I feel like they can kick the can as long as the everyone is happy and inflation isn't here. But I'm just struggling to square that circle where I'm like, okay, we have all this debt, we have inflation. I know it can go down, but like you said, they get to that level, that 5%, just to inject liquidity again. I'm thinking to myself, how in the world do we not get inflation again? I struggle with wrapping my head around that.
yeah. Inflation is a very interesting, like, if it's a very interesting phenomenon that takes place. And this is really where, like, I think it's very easy to make up, like, or to come up with like logical reasons why you have the inflation, right? I mean, that money printer go burr, prices go up, right? What else do you need
Yep.
to know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that's like, and that's although that intuitively that just so much makes sense. That's not really the case, right?
True.
Because if that was the case, quantitative easing one, two, three, and four would have done exactly that. But it didn't happen. The Federal Reserve failed to achieve their 2% inflation target during those years. I mean, they got above it a couple of times, but they still failed pretty much to achieve the 2% inflation target that they were going for during the quantitative easing programs during that time. So, like, what is it that's really taken place, right? Inflation really, it's not just a matter of printing up money, because you print up a bunch of money, and the way that the quantitative easing program works is that most of that ends up sitting as reserves in the big banks. Right? It doesn't actually make it to the system. The way it actually gets into the system is through lending, right? So people borrowing that money and then go and buying stuff with it. That's one of the reasons why you saw asset prices move up as high as they did, is because people borrow money to go and buy stocks and cars and houses and all kinds of stuff, right? So if you can't borrow the money, then you don't see those assets go. Now, the money injection that took place this time was a little different because everybody got it, right?
Yeah.
It went into all channels at once. And that's like a much different story, because now all of a sudden everybody has the money in their pocket to go and spend it the way they normally would. Right. Like when you're doing quantitative easing one, two, three, and four, you had to borrow the money, and then there's only a certain way that it can get into the system. But when you have all this stimulus and everybody has a hold of it, now they can just go and spend it freely like they normally would. And that continual purchase right there is what drives the inflation, right? It has to enter all channels at the same time, at the same
Hmm.
moment, right? And this is what does it. But even still, then it's only going to find its way to the things that people are attracted to, cars, right? That's
Yeah.
why you saw cars move up, right? You saw all this stuff, but that doesn't necessarily explain like some of the commodities that are out there that people aren't just going off and buying. Like, not everybody goes and buys lumber, right? I mean, that's like,
No.
only something a handful of people are really going to buy, but yet lumber shot way up. Well, it's because there's two things happening here. We had a supply chain breakdown, and we had the stimulus at the same time. And so what ended up happening is that we got let me get in the camera. Here we go. We have the supply and demand issue, right? All of a sudden supply falls and demand goes way up. Right? And now this gap right there is going to create price swings, right? Supply and demand issues. So now we have to think, is it the Federal Reserve that's doing it? Or was it the supply chain breakdown? Because now here we have demands coming down, but the inflation stayed up, right? Why? Because supply was still low, right? So it's not necessarily the demand that was doing it, but yet here supply is trying to figure out its balance, trying to come back up. So I was much more under the impression that this had to do with more of the shooting in the foot of the supply chain, severing that, telling people to stay home, no trucking, no shipping, no containers, no anything, none of this stuff. and then at the same time put out a mass media attention to the money printer go burr,
Mhm.
because now this is people's perceptions. And once you have inflation anchored at a higher rate, now we have inflation that can really take hold, because inflation is a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
And this is in, again, right back to this speech. This is something that John Williams was talking about. He says it right here in the speech. In fact, I had it highlighted. Let me see if I can read it. God, I can't see it in here. It says, in other words, monetary policy is always swimming upstream, fighting a current of too low inflation expectations that interferes with achieving the target of inflation rate. So they wanted the inflation expectation to be quite elevated, right? They didn't really, not necessarily inflation, not necessarily all the other stuff, the expectation to be much higher. If they can get the expectation higher, then they can get their monetary policy working again. They
Mm.
got it working again, right?
Yeah.
This is their back up in business. So again, like I couldn't tell you what exactly is coming into the future, what their monetary policies are going to say. I know they wanted that 5%. I didn't think they were going to get it. They
Yeah.
almost got it, you know? And
Yeah.
so like I have to look at this and say I don't know what the Fed is going to do, but it doesn't appear to me that they're failing. It seems to me that they are right on track with what they
Right.
were intending on doing.
But I look at, like, the other side of the coin, which is government spending, and I go, "Well, wouldn't it be inflationary if we have more and more people relying on Social Security, which was a combination of a treasury of saved up payments and transfer payments today from people like you and I paying into Social Security. But if there's more being taken out and the government funds that difference by selling treasuries, one way or another, isn't that injecting more liquidity that isn't being taken out of the economy? It is injecting straight up dollars into an economy without productivity attached to those
Yeah.
dollars. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, no, I mean that's straight up what's happening. We are borrowing money to get the new money to live our life. I mean
Yeah.
that we are living on a credit card, straight up, like straight up.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that's that. Yeah, I mean, there's no other way to really look at it. And this is the worst kind of way of beginning money injection, because, like, it's like really, it doesn't have any limit until it's just done, until it's over.
Yeah.
I mean, at least with other ways of, like when you look at the Cantillon effect of new money coming in, that new money, like the way he describes it, is with the silver mine or, domestic production. Um, Maybe even like foreign people moving to your area bringing money in, but that's like there's got to be new money. That's the whole
Mhm.
point. It's got to be new money constantly pouring into the system. If you don't have that new money coming in, then all of a sudden the luxuries turn off, and
Yep.
that's a problem, because the luxuries are coming from foreign purchases, right? You're
Mm.
purchasing it from foreign entities.
Yep.
And now you can see, like, our entire economy is almost based off of this, right? If we didn't have foreign production coming into this country, we wouldn't have things to sell in this country. Like, I mean, I work at a hardware store. Half the stuff we have in, like, 90% of the stuff we have in there is made by somebody else, right?
Mhm.
Not by domestic manufacturers. So if I didn't have all that stuff in my store to sell, how would I have a job?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we
Yeah.
got to literally bring this stuff in so that we can sell it to each other and have a
Mm.
job. Or else none of us will have anything to do. We are literally inhabitants for no reason. Like, we don't
Yeah.
really serve much of a purpose other than to be the filter of this whole monetary system, and to keep the military industrial complex going, because that's really what it's all about, is
Yeah.
to, if we can keep the inhabitants happy by buying foreign products, giving them a little bit of conveniences that, pleasure their life, then, you can really abuse the hell out of the system, build up a military that just protects all the shipping channels, and if anybody disagrees, you blow them up. Um, and that's really where I find, like, this whole, like, situation that we got going on with Russia, Ukraine. I'm like, this is not. I mean, I'm not one to get into politics. I'm not a military. I mean, I grew up in the military as far as my family and stuff like that, but I don't follow any of this stuff. But I'm pretty sure that anything that's taken place on this planet is being allowed to happen.
Mm.
You
Hmm.
know, and I mean, I don't like putting it that way, because that really changes the way a lot of people see, like, not only our government, but the way they treat people and stuff like that. But that's truly the way I see it. It's much easier to blame it on this than it is. Okay, you know what? I did a story the other day. You know Vlad the Impaler?
Mhm.
You heard of this guy, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so he got his country when he was like 18 years old, 17, 18 years old is when he took rule of his country. Okay? And I don't know how he got this training, but he was trained and schooled by the enemy, right? Right.
Mm.
So his dad made this deal with this foreign country, is saying, okay, well, I've done, kicked your butt. I'm going to take over everything you got. And they were like, no, we don't think so. This isn't really working out very well. How about you have control over this country, but you give us your son so that you don't just absolutely destroy us, right? And so
Mm.
basically, his son was kind of like protection for the enemy,
Mm.
and they raised him. Right? They raised this guy. So he comes back to his land to take over, and he finds that there's two classes of people, right? The ultra rich and the super poor, right? And there is a lot of poor people, like a lot of them. They bred like rabbits. So he knew that he had to do something about it because these people are going to be in a constant poverty and a drain on society. So he rounded them all up for a big banquet. Right? He says, "Hey, we're going to have this great big giant party for you guys. All right? Why don't you everybody come and eat and party and have a great time." So everybody shows up to this party, locks the doors, and burns the place down.
Mm.
How many times through history have you heard like these weird economic genocides? Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a lot easier to say, "Oh man, these guys are fighting. Oh, what do we do?" Right? Because you
Mm.
can't just go and kill people.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. Now, I'm not saying that's the case, but I'm just looking for the economic powers that are taking place right now. And I just look back through history and say, hey, man, when did we have some mass genocides and what was the reasonings behind it? Okay. I don't appreciate that kind of thing, And
No.
I grew up military. My whole family is. I have a huge, huge appreciation for everybody who served, even including yourself, right? You said you
Yep.
served.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, you guys hold a special place in my heart. My little sister graduated high school early so she could join the Marines, right? I
Yep.
mean, I'm the only person in my family who didn't join the military. And so when I see this kind of stuff, it hurts,
Yep.
and I see the pain that a lot of people have to go through just economically. Then I see like stuff like this taking place, and it's just,
Yeah.
I mean, these are the type of things like, when you get into macroeconomics, a lot of people who start studying it for the first time, they realize that their gut hurts all the time. All right. You'll eventually get through that. It'll go away. But I tell you, the stuff that and you see is very
Mhm.
depressing when you start getting into the deeps of this.
Yeah, that's why I say ignorance is bliss to some degree, because 'cause you're just
Oh
like,
man, is it ever?
"Oh." Yeah. Um, yeah, I think most people, including myself, if you asked them about the military industrial complex, they're like, "Yeah, totally agree with that." Like, if you asked your average soldier what they were doing in Afghanistan, they couldn't give you an answer. So, um, that just goes to show. And then they were all proven right, in 2021 when we pulled out of there, and like, what do we have to show for all this? Um, but so I wanted to ask you one more question. So
Yeah, you did.
the so what so the hope I have, eventually it's going to collapse. I think the best hope we have is some kind of parallel economy where you educate people and they're like, hey, this is dying, so I should transfer it to something else, whether it be gold or silver, what have you. But
Mhm.
normally, when a currency kicks the can, they have to come in and the government has to come in and offer something that people trust. And it's not the government's word because that's what they lied about before, about the previous currency. So it has to be backed by something, at least nominally. So do you think in the future, gold backed currency? I saw George Gammon um, wrote something on Twitter. It was a pretty good poll. He asked people, would you rather have a populace that wants a small government with a fiat currency, so a populace that desires a small government, or a populace that desires big government with a gold backed or Bitcoin currency? And a lot of people's assumption is, well, some kind of a fixed monetary unit will restrict government size anyway, so I'll pick that. But it really has to do with the populace. Like if the populace demands free stuff, populace demands take his stuff and give it to me. It doesn't matter if like monetary units don't restrict them. But my question for you is what do you see is next? So we have however long the dollar lasts, whether we go to CBDCs, what have you, eventually it's all going to blow up. And we need to trust in something again. Can that be gold? And how do we not repeat the same mistake as before, which is government backs the currency and then whoops, print too much, spend too much?
Uh,
How would you answer that?
okay. I don't think gold could ever go back to the currency again. Not without a complete and utter collapse, because there's too much that's been promised in fiat to go back to a gold. Now, we could try and do like a transitionary thing where you start issuing, like, say, US Treasury that's, like, say, due in a certain amount of dollars or an ounce of gold or the equivalent of what an ounce of gold would be, and then give it some sort of backing that way. That could be like an integration into a gold standard where you could have like treasuries, an asset that's backed by gold, that's government issue kind of thing. In that sense, then you would have somewhat of a start to a gold standard. That doesn't seem very likely to me.
Mm,
That something like that would happen. Just mainly because that's a restriction to government, and they're not going to play any game where they're going to voluntarily do that, right? Like, if they had an issue with selling the U.S. Treasuries and they needed something to try and offer that's going to back that U.S. Treasury that's not the dollar, in the past they offered up like German marks and Swiss francs, right? So they wrote U.S. treasuries. They were called Carter bonds. Yeah, it was pretty cool.
mm,
Yeah, during the Carter administration, because the demand for dollars was just depleted. Like, it was, nobody in the world wanted them. See, that's the difference between like the 1970s inflation and the inflation we got today. Back in the 70s, people were pissed. They didn't want the dollar. They were like, the whole
mm,
world was like abandoning the dollar. And the U.S. Treasury was like, man, what are we doing here? We got to figure out this thing because nobody really wants these. And they're like, okay, well, nobody wants the dollars, then back it with German marks and Swiss francs. Maybe they'll sell. Then they did, right?
mm,
So for a short time, they sold U.S. Treasuries that were due in a foreign nation's currency, which is, yeah, that's something that just blows people's mind. Um, so again, like, how is it that, that they transition to another type of currency? That's going to be really difficult because, like, you got to think, like, why was the Fed even sold to the government? Like, how are they, like, why would the Fed would even be in existence? Like, what was it that they had going on at the time? And what's a lot of people don't like really take into consideration when you have a gold standard is that you have booms and bust cycles to the business, right? And that is very difficult and it's very hard for people to deal with, right? Because if you're not understanding of that cycle, you're thinking you're in the money, right? But when you're in the money, you should be saving the money, right? Getting prepared for the bad times because the cycle will come to an end. And when that does, then you have a redistribution of the wealth again. So you have a concentration of wealth and a redistribution. Boom, boom, boom. This is the business cycle that takes place. And it happened over and over and over again. And people were like, man, this is too painful. We can't handle this. And the Fed was like, you know what we could do is that when the economy starts picking up, right, and all this money that we have like changing hands that starts concentrating into the hands of a few because there's so much business taking place, that starts depleting the amount of commerce that's available because there's less money, right? We can inject money into the system, or an elastic money supply, right? So the Federal Reserve during hot times would add money to the currency, right, to facilitate the trades that were taking place. And then when the economy slowed down, they would pull that money back out, right? So they had an elastic money supply, and they were going to coast through the business cycles. This was like the idea behind it. Well, what ended up happening is they created debt cycles instead, right? So they have booms and bust cycles to the debt that's now taking place instead of the business cycle. you can't
mm,
you can't stop the economic powers. There's going to be,
right.
it's just going to, the way it goes down. So again, like, how do we transition to another currency, right? I mean, it's just like, if you have, the Federal Reserve was sold to have an elastic money supply so that we can coast through the business cycles. If we go back to gold standard, well, we've got to take on the idea that we're going to have booms and bust cycles again, and nobody's wanting to do that. Nope.
Mm,
And so, without having the booms and bust cycles, it's going to be very difficult to have like a commodity based currency like gold.
Mm,
Now, same thing I feel when it comes to the cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin would be in the exact same boat. The only difference with Bitcoin and gold would be that Bitcoin could actually facilitate the trades much faster than gold could. And you wouldn't have to worry about securities and, all the other crap that goes along with the physical possession of gold. So Bitcoin, in my opinion, could do the exact same thing that gold could do, but much quicker and better and faster and easier than gold could. And considering that you got secondary systems that could like operate Bitcoin in a much faster way, like Lightning Network. I don't know if you're familiar with that,
yep,
but it's
oh,
like
yeah,
this. Okay. So anyway, like you can have these secondary systems that operate the Bitcoin, facilitate the Bitcoin trades and much easier.
right,
Okay. So those two are possible. In the end, it's not going to be that way. In my opinion, it's going to be the central bank digital currencies. It's going to be everybody locked into that beast system. It's going to be stimulus packages. It might be UBI. This is the type of environment that we're going into, and that separation. That the most important like understanding of this is that there is no like taking them out, like those guys, they're there. And no matter
mhm.
what system ends up, it's like
You mean
you're
the
either in
rich?
poverty or like, yeah, they're
Yeah,
not losing theirs,
yeah,
right? They're gonna keep it. Like we
yeah,
either live or die, right?
yeah,
But they stay.
yeah,
And so understanding that part of it is just like, we I mean, I don't put myself in a slave mentality, but I also understand that I'm an inhabitant. I'm not one of the elitist. I'm not, somebody who's ever going to achieve that sort of level. And so I need to protect myself from the effects of that kind of thing.
mhm,
So that's really how I see it is that, think about the way that they could most likely keep you enslaved, keep you in debt, keep you working, keep you under their power. That's the system that's going to continue, right? Not the
mm,
one that's going to benefit you where you can have like a decent savings in life and, work real hard and hold on to your money and then have something in the end, like what the gold standard would be. No, that's not going to be allowed. Not because it's not the way that
yeah,
doesn't benefit them, right?
right.
So you got to
Do
think
you
whatever benefits them, that's the system that's going to go and, do your best to try and protect yourself from that.
Yeah, that's why I say, like, learning about macro, it's not always dollars and cents, sometimes hedging against you understand where the interests lie, right? So you usually can assume what decisions they make. Do you think that Bitcoin could be, maybe like a check and balance on, corruption? In other words, if you can just go, "Okay, fine, you're gonna do that with that currency, I'm just gonna step right over here and use this." As soon as you abuse the CBDC, I at least have an option.
Mhm.
And I don't think that'll happen anytime soon, but do you think something that's decentralized outside of government control, that's a parallel economy, would keep them in check to a level where they know
Um,
people have an option B?
All right, so my little anarchist mind loves to fantasize of the idea that central bank digital currencies would spark the idea that people would really start to understand digital currencies, not just necessarily the central bank issued one, but digital currencies in general. And if you start understanding digital currencies and then start understanding smart contracts and how smart contracts work, it really gives like I guess a good way for somebody who's never heard of a smart contract or have any idea what we're talking about here. If you can imagine like a contract that was written and it's now a digital form, so it's in the computer systems, right? And it's going to make a decision on which, or it's not, it doesn't make a decision. A decision will be made, and this contract will either fulfill one way or the other, right? So basically, if the horse wins the race, this person gets paid. If the horse loses, that person's get paid. Once that contract is set into motion, there's nothing that can be done about it, right? It's
Mhm.
it's off it's off and going. And then once the event occurs, the contract fulfills. The neat thing about this is that now you don't have to take anybody to court to say, "Hey man, you didn't fulfill your contract."
Yeah,
Right? So if this is the way lots and all contracts are written, well then you can kind of make the courts irrelevant. You can make
yeah,
governments irrelevant,
yeah,
right? So yeah, let's make them irrelevant.
yeah,
It's like go ahead and do whatever you're gonna do, guys.
yeah,
But
yeah,
we're writing contracts over here without you.
I like it. Do you
Yeah,
know,
I do too.
are you familiar with Michael Malice? Do you know who he is?
Seems like I should.
He's an anarchist, and he's a pretty good, he's crazy smart guy. He just wrote a book called The White Pill. You'd probably be very interested in
I
it.
probably
It's
would.
about the USSR and how that was a hopeless scenario, way more than any scenario we've been in today, like in my lifetime. The USSR was, and yet the Berlin Wall fell and USSR was disbanded. So it's kind of fascinating. Look up Michael Mouse; you'd really like him if you're
Yeah,
into
I will.
anarchist. But hey, man, I'll let you go. I really appreciate you taking the time. If you could stick around after I hit end, I'll close it out with you. But thanks everyone for watching. Thanks Simon for your time. I'll see y'all in the next one.
All
Peace.
righty. Thank you, man. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.